Today we're going to talk about another principle of design. It's one I've had to talk about before in connection to other things, but we're going to study it in isolation now. So we're talking about rhythm, or the idea of repetition. Rhythm is the regular or ordered repetition of dominant and subordinate units, and in this case we're talking about in a two-dimensional composition, a piece of 2D design. But rhythm is just something that's so essential to biological life in general, to the way the world around us works, and to us as creatures, that it's nice if we can get that in our images as well. We respond very positively to music. It's in our heartbeat. You want our heartbeat to be maintaining a consistent tempo. It's in the seasons. It's in the cycle of like light and dark in a day. We subdivide time up into minutes and hours. So this idea of subdividing things into even units is very important to us. I'm going to, as we talk about this, have to talk about, well, I don't have to, but I think it will be helpful if we talk about rhythmic theory and music and then attach that to visuals, and hopefully that will help you get a better sense for it. I find that helps because rhythm is something we tend to feel, and if we can feel it then it's, and see it at the same time, you can really understand it. So in music theory, well, pretty much in anything, it's like when we talked about proportion. So like with proportion, rhythm is just ratio, and ratio is just fractions or subdividing something. So we're going to take, say I had an inch right here, say this represented an inch, and then I cut it into 4 even pieces. That's an ordered repetition. That's what we mean by a predictable ordered repetition. It's 4 things of the same size. In music theory, we would call this a bar of music, and then this would be a bar of 4 beats. So if each one of these represented a beat, we'd be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. We'd count that out. In music theory, so this is this is a bar with 4 beats in it. Then we would have the fraction, what looks like a fraction. It's called a time signature in music. A 4/4 would be 4 bars of 4 beats apiece. So we'll take now each one of these as a bar and subdivide it into 4 beats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4. And I'll go ahead and play that in a second. So what you're listening for is each one of these is a bar. The green here will have a bass drum hitting on it, and the same on all of these, and then these magentas will be having like a snare hit on it. These are just crappy things I made in Fruity Loops, but it should get the idea across of what a 4/4 sounds like. This is your standard time signature that you hear in pretty much all pop and rap music. Okay, so you should be pretty familiar with that. You should be able to feel that type of beat. You would hear it in like any kind of electronic dance music, pretty much most rock and roll, most rap. It's not going to be that exact pattern, but it will have that sense of a 4/4 pulse to it. And here, the most important thing for us is being able to visualize the ratio relationship of 4 units broken up versus 1 unit, and then placing this unit like basically every 8. Like 4, then you hit, then you have 8, and then 8. So visual rhythm. Here we have a visual representation of 4/3 rhythm, which is we're going to have 4 bars, but it's going to have 3 beats apiece. So you'll see that the beats are bigger. The time from here to here is the same, so the beats occupy a little bit larger distance because we're subdividing it into less units. This is something you'll hear more in blues, and if you pay attention, this will have a tss, 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 like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But this will still sound like what we just listened to. Boom, cat, boom, cat. So we're going to listen to that now. One, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Alright, so you'll see how that ratio relationship is different. I've subdivided this unit into 3 instead of into 4. We could also change the relationships of the bars to beats, so we could have 3 bars with 4 beats each, rather than 4 bars of 3 beats each, and so then you get the 1 2 3 4 2 2 3 4 3 2 3 4. I'll play that. So see, that has a little bit of a bouncier sound and feel to it, and so like a visual that has that in it might be a little bit more bouncy as well. This is less standard for you to hear in popular music, but you'll still hear, you could still hear that in some things. Now, this is a representation, and we'll see this in an image soon, but a representation of a polyrhythm. So this is when things aren't evenly subdivided, like the lines don't always match up. You look in these, the lines match up evenly. The lines match up evenly like on a grid. Here you'll see that the lines don't always match up evenly. So if I take these 4 units here, these 4 bars, I could break them into 3 beats, or I could break them into 4 beats. If I break them into 3 beats, the time span between is larger, and if I break them into 4 beats, the time span's smaller. So a polyrhythm has basically 2 different subdivisions going on at the same time, and it sounds a little bit weird at first, but most of you, I'm assuming, are getting used to this sound. This would be basically called triplets: 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 on top of a more standard 4/4 beat. So you have the standard 4/4 and then a triplet on top of it. And you should all, if you listen to any rap, you're used to hearing this now, because starting with like Migos and a lot of these mumble rappers, you get this sound of the triplet over top of a 4/4. So that would sound something like this. Okay, and you can hear in the hi-hat it's playing in 3 while there's a pulse of a 4 underneath it. So like I was saying, you hear this a lot in rap now. What they're doing is they're actually changing. Maybe they'll have 2 up here, and then they'll have 3, and then they'll put 6 or 9 or 7. So I'll play something here that flows through some different changes. Usually in the rap, they're either doing this with the hi-hats, so I did it with the hi-hats, or they're just using their flow to capture the sound. So you hear changes in the hi-hats. 3, 4, 6, 8, 9. Then we'll go back to 2, 3. So triplets. Now in 4. Now in 6. So you're all getting familiar with that type of stuff. That used to be a little bit weirder type of thing to hear in pop music. You can also expand that out, and then you could subdivide. Instead of having this division not line up at every unit, you could subdivide into what's called a polymeter. I know this is getting weird. But you could just place the bass drum on every 4. So I'm taking the bar and I'm breaking it into 4 beats, which is normal. But normally everything would fall on the 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4. Here we'll treat this division like it's in 3, and this is like 4. So you get a snare hit every 3 and a bass hit every 4. And you'll see that the relationship, and this is again what's important for us, is the visual of how they line up here. They offset by 1 here, they offset by 2 here, and then it syncs up on the other side over here. It touches this side, and then it syncs up again. And then we'll just, technically we should have a beat here, but that would leave 2 as we wrap back around, so we can just go ahead and leave that empty. You could do it however you want it. But the thing here is to see how this thing slowly shifts away and back lines up. That's a good visual strategy we could use. So I'm going to play this. This is something you've definitely heard in a pop song as well that makes it feel a little more dancey. So that's called polymeter. You have 2 different time signatures running against each other. So up top you have something that's in 4 beats of 4, and at bottom you have something that's 6 beats of 3, and then the last 2 beats just get cut off, so you start back over again. Okay, now that's probably all a lot of like, why in the heck are we listening to all this? But when we come back to this image that we look at now, we can see all of those polyrhythmic and polymetric relationships in the image. So you have this consistent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 against 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you have a 6/5 polymetric relationship, and then there's a 4 underneath it, and then you have a 1 unit by itself, like right in the middle of everything. So it has that, visually, it has that same interrelationship of these varying ratios. So I went ahead and programmed just a little beat here that has 4 against 5 against 6, which is weird because they don't line up very easily. You have to let it run for a long time to line up. And it's definitely not something that would match most types of songs you're used to. But as chaotic as it is, it's actually pretty orderly, and if you can see it and hear it at the same time, and then the apple will be like this accent note in the middle of it. So it may feel weird and chaotic at first, but you can get used to listening to those kinds of things. And as weird as they seem when you listen to them as sound, visually they wind up being very pleasing, in my opinion. And you can embed them in images to get a real sense of time. You can embed them in images to lead the eye through. A lot of what we're talking about when we're talking about leading an eye through directional forces and using different types of contrast is we're trying to create a nice pleasing rhythm, and then the saccadic movements of your eye as they flow around all these different points of emphasis and subordination, they'll get into this little dance, and if you can keep the viewer's eyes moving around in a pleasing dance, it will be a pleasing experience in the piece. So you can see, like in Elegy to the Spanish Republic, number 54 by Robert Motherwell, there's like these things can almost be read as beats, and these are maybe pauses, so you'd have like pause, and you'd have that structure in there. Or you could count these as pauses and have, and you get that same kind of rhythmic sense in the piece. So it lets our eye bounce around, and it feels good. This piece we've been looking at by John Moore has all kinds of those polyrhythmic subdivisions that I was talking about, where we take one unit and we subdivide it into 2 units, but then over here we're taking a unit which doesn't quite line up, and we're subdividing that into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 units. So we would have like 9 against 4 or something like that. And then these are pretty much split evenly side to side. But so this space here gets subdivided into 2, and you have all of the subdivisions here where you split that into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can see how that relates to what I was talking about with this 4 against 5 against 6, or 4, 4, 3, 4. It has that same sense of musical notation. And then like in a ruler, it subdivides even further, where it splits the halves in half type of thing. So it's this idea of just breaking things up into even units. You'll see that in an image like this, Dawn by Odd Nerdrum. There's a sense of musicality in it. Obviously some things are smaller, so they register as not taking up too much time, but there's the repeated element of 4. There's a repeated element of 3, but it's less orderly. There's more of a gap here that's covered by the shadow. So this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, or this would be 1, 2, 3, 4. You don't have that pause. Then up here there's these rhythms, and you can start to see, once you're aware of it, how this reads almost like sheet music. And you have these guys sitting here singing, so it adds to the sense of musicality. And then the way their feet line up in certain places add a little bit more of a hiccup to the thing, so it starts to get a little bit more polyrhythmic. Here, this painting by Gerard Sicotto, you have, it's called The Sound of the Pick, so it's very much about the sound. And obviously you can think about these people out, they're all picking in the same order, they're doing enforced labor, and so you'd have this constant sound of everyone just whack, whack, whack. And then you can think about them out there singing as well. So there's this sense of time embedded in it. There's a sense of motion, like rhythm. Rhythm implies time, and time implies motion, and that all implies musicality. And you can see that is important to the subject matter of this painting. Here you'll see Giacomo Balla's Hand of the Violinist. This is obviously about motion and music. He was obsessed with that in his career. You'll see every little paint stroke is like a unit of the same size, so it almost looks like a sheet of music up top. There's a sense of rhythm throughout the whole thing. The way that the hand is moving, it doesn't just capture motion, but it also captures the sense of like 1, 2, 3, 5, 1, 2, 4, 5. Or sorry, 6 at the end there. So you can see it's again like a 5 against 6. Everything in here is about motion and music and breaking things up into rhythmic subdivisions. Here's another funny, more humorous Giacomo Balla, Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash. So you see how he's using this idea of rhythm and repetition to capture motion and time with this little dachshund's tail wagging. This one's not as musical to look at, but we definitely get a sense of freezing time, freezing the fourth dimension. Here's another Giacomo Balla, swift passive movement dynamic sequence. So here you can see the birds in motion. This was done in 1913, so not too long after we had photography come into existence and we could finally capture things in motion and see what they look like stitched together. Animation was in its infancy at this point. So people were very interested in the idea of motion over time, repetition of an image to create a sense of time and motion. And you'll see again this subdivision into smaller units, larger divisions in the piece, the sense of rhythm and polyrhythm throughout the whole thing. And it just makes it exciting to look at. Chris Ware, he's doing comics, and they're about the passage of time. And so he's very intentionally saying, okay, here's this one space, and I can make this image feel like it takes longer by subdividing a series of smaller motions into it. So this is kind of to be understood as all happening at once, pretty much. Like if this is 1 second a piece, then this would represent 4 seconds. And then if this whole thing, took like 4 seconds, then each one of these would maybe represent 2 seconds. And you can again see how he's subdividing all those times against each other. So it's a very powerful way to if you're doing a comic, let your readers know how fast time is passing. Now, this also extends over into the human fascination with pattern. Pattern is just the ordered repetition of a single design element. And by single design element, I mean the entire little chunk. So if I'm looking at a pattern like this chunk here is the pattern, and then it gets repeated. And then within that, it has smaller patterns also that get repeated. So you can combine smaller repeated elements into larger repeated elements, and you get this crazy mirror-like structures, which we'll talk about more later, these radial symmetries out that create these beautiful, beautiful things to look at. So this is the mosque, the Iwan entrance to Islamic mosque, and pattern is very important in the Islamic culture because it's basically considered to be heresy to paint an image of something, draw an image of something that actually looks real, because you're stealing God's power. You're God gets to create things that look real, so humans are left to pattern. But I think also in religious art you get pattern because it's the closest we can get, I think, in a visual representation to the idea of God, the creator, as this master genius that's able to create the most intricate thing ever existence and put it all together so that everything has its perfect place and works just perfectly. If you take that idea seriously as a religious person, I don't think you can get a better repetition of what a God would do than do pattern. It's just God's pattern would be infinitely more complex than what we could come up with. Remember when we talked about complexity and chaos and randomness and ordering principles when we were talking about unity and variety? God would be the ultimate, organizer of variety into unity, and pattern is one of the best representations we can get in that. So you see pattern all over the place in many different religions. It's also in terms of unity and variety, a really easy way to get a sense of unity and variety. So here we have this Kehinde Wiley painting of LL Cool J, and Kehinde Wiley uses these patterns all the time in his image. Now obviously LL Cool J was a rapper, so you want this sense of like musicality in the piece already. But then imagine if this was just on a red or a green background. It would be pretty boring. It would be too unified. So if you remember back from when we were talking about unity, like unity is pretty boring to look at. There's not much information. So we want some variety, but we don't want too much variety. So one of the easiest ways to get a sense of unity and variety balanced out is to do a whole bunch of the same thing over and over. The fact that there's a whole bunch of these makes it look like there's variety, but the fact that it's the same thing over and over automatically visually unifies them. And remember the Gestalt principle of similarity, they're gonna feel like an organized whole when it's the same thing repeated over and over. So we respond really well to pattern because it is that perfect sweet spot between unity and variety following some kind of very predictable ordering pattern. Here you'll see another Kehinde Wiley painting. He did President Barack Obama's presidential portrait that would, hang in the National Gallery. So in this one, he's not using as strong of a pattern as this, but there's this very similar type of idea going on with the leaves where it's a repeated unit. It's just not perfectly organized into a perfectly like rhythmic thing like this, but there's still this repetition of leaves everywhere, which creates a visually complex background, right? There's a lot going on in there, but it's also easy to background it. Again, if we would have just had a flat green background behind here, this would be a much more boring picture. So he's able to use this loose idea of patterning versus a strict idea of patterning, loose idea of patterning to keep this visually interesting, rhythmic, compelling, but still really not override the figure, which is, the most important thing here. We're painting a president. Now, there's a special type of pattern that's constructed out of one single unit that repeats over and over, and that's a tessellation. And so here, and they can't be any gaps, like you can't have a shape that has gaps between it. So here we have just this diamond shape, and it rotates to fill up every possible space on here. So that's a perfect example of a tessellation. I'm going to be sending you to a link of a video that talks about how to create a tessellation pattern, and that's going to be one of your assignments, is to create a tessellation. Probably the most famous artist to use tessellation was M.C. Escher. Now, he expanded the idea a little bit to where what he considered one shape, so one shape would actually contain one fish and one bird. That would be one whole shape that repeats, but technically it looks like two shapes. He did these very clever things, and he was really interested in mathematics and ratios and all that kind of stuff. He did this very clever thing where he's able to create these interlocking tessellations of two different things. And he's playing here then with your figure-ground relationship as well. So you remember the idea of figure-ground reversal. Whether you're paying attention to the white, you'll see the fish, or you're paying attention to this orangish color, you'll see birds. And it's pretty unlikely that you'll see both at the same time. You'll flip-flop back and forth. And he did it here as well with the angels and demons. So if you're paying attention to the black, if that's considered the figure, then you'll be seeing demons, and the white's just the ground. Or if you're paying attention to the white, the black becomes the background, and then you see the angels. So for this, like one piece of the pattern would be an angel and a demon, and then the way they interlock together creates the tessellation. So this is a fun thing. It can get really complicated to make one of these, but I'm going to show you a pretty simple way to do it, and we're going to make a design that has to do with this. And again, I think this hits that sweet spot that humans seem to really like between variety and order. And then also when it gets clever like this, it gets to that idea of like, man, you must be a super genius to be able to figure this out. So it starts to represent the idea of a perfect, like godlike super intelligence. But these are very effective things, and you want to be thinking about repetition, rhythm, order, and pattern as a way to unify variety in all of your images. And it will also help you with balance, which we'll be talking about next.